Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to kick around the idea of the fossil record. Yeah, I hope this conversation will provide some interest to you. I think the fossil record, the first thing I kind of want to say about it is that it's been such an important source of evidence for organisms changing on the planet Earth. It's remarkable how it's been a chronology of the life history of organisms, not just recent times, but millions of years ago. We're able to go back, sort of like looking at the annual rings of a tree. We're able to go back in time, old newspapers, if you will, and sort of uncover some of the great organisms that have lived in the past that no longer live today. They're sort of the biological historical documents of our time. And so one of the things that I want to say about this is that the fossil record in terms of evolutionary biology is both a process. Evolutionary biology is a process. In other words, like natural selection, preferential reproduction between different variations in a population, reproductive success, and then speciation and history. So all of this is combined, and we can see this occurring in the fossil record. It's pretty awesome. So I want to start off by introducing you to, or maybe not introducing, but reacquainting you with this sort of fish called the stickleback, and it has these dorsal fins that are kind of spiky, which allow it to, not necessarily resist being caught by a predator, but predators don't seem to enjoy getting poked by these fins. But biologists have been interested in these sticklebacks for several decades, and it's because you could see here there's evidence that the marine form of a stickleback is capable, sort of like a salmon, of living in the salt water and the fresh water. And the marine version is heavily armored with these plates, which prevent it from being chewed up by toothed predators in the ocean. But when you look at freshwater versions of this lake that have the freshwater versions of this fish that have been isolated in lakes for several thousands of years, you could see that they've given away their heavy armor for being a little bit faster, and they have reduced dorsal fins. And so what's interesting is that natural selection, because the predator in some of these natural lakes are these dragonfly larvae that like to hold on to those dorsal fins. And so if you're a stickleback fish and live in the lake, you have a better chance of surviving a differential reproductive success, having more offspring if you have reduced. So we could see natural selection in process occurring. And what's totally cool about this is that it's led us to the understanding that some of these sticklebacks in different lakes are actually different species. There's about 40 different species depending on where you are, if you're studying these, like for example in some of the lakes in Canada and around Vancouver, or if you're up in Alaska studying these. Pretty cool example of adaptive radiation. So the generation of whole new species based on the fact that maybe they don't they're isolated in different lakes, but even if you bring them together, they don't reproduce with one another behaviorally. So they don't really, females don't choose to mate with some of the males that are different in appearance. Kind of interesting. So we can actually see the result of natural selection, so microevolution, changing phenotype in a population, resulting in macroevolution, or this new species over time. And what's totally remarkable about this, and what the heart of what this video is really about, is that we have evidence in the fossil record of these stickleback fish that have been preserved, and we can see whatever various traits that we're considering. We could look at the dorsal fin, and we could look at the hind fin, and actually see how these changes in phenotype have been occurring historically in the past as well, given the varying environmental conditions that our Earth is infamous for. And so the fossil record, pretty cool. But, Charles Darwin wasn't the very first person to think that life has been changing over time. Sometimes he's given that credit. Other naturalists were familiar with life has been changing in the fossil record and evolving. Charles Darwin just gave us the mechanism that is of natural selection. So the fossil record is a record of change. And so this is an important statement. And so when you look at, this is a great example of fossils here in the Grand Canyon in Arizona in the United States, where you can see layers and layers of sedimentary rock formed by the erosion of this canyon by the Colorado River. And what we see in the fossil record is that fossil fish, which are a little bit lower in the fossil record, predate land vertebrates, which are up here, which then predate amphibians, which are up here. And then next followed by reptiles that are here, and then mammals that are up here. So it's like going back in time, looking at fossil records. It's like layers upon layers of sediment have preserved these organisms, and you can sort of go back and look at the history of life changing on the earth. Now, just to acknowledge the fact that a creationist perspective might be that life was all created in one particular time, and that is not what the paleontologists actually observe when they go back in the fossil record. Just wanted to acknowledge that. And so the major goal of evolutionary biology is to sort of reconstruct. It's like not necessarily, I won't be dramatic as a crime scene where you're trying to reconstruct the scene from something that happened in the past, but kind of like that. You're going back in time and searching and trying to reconstruct what life was like before we were around to observe it. And so like I was mentioning, the stickleback, you could look at things, for example, if you could find this in the fossil record, you could look at the fact whether or not it had a complete pelvic area and a really pronounced hind fin, or whether or not it was reduced. And then you can sort of come to conclusions about what were the environmental conditions favoring that. So it's going back and looking at life's history through the fossil records. And why are we interested in that? For a variety of reasons, but one of them is systematics, which is this biological study of the diversity of life on this planet in an evolutionary context. And what I mean by that is biologists like to look at different species and try to understand their relationship to one another. So their phylogeny, in other words, their evolutionary history as a species as it relates to another species. So we could say, if we're staying with the stickleback, we could say that one species of stickleback, species 1, is more closely related to species 2 than it is 3. And that what we can draw this phylogenetic tree and then see that this lineage of species 2 and the species 1, right in this area, these fish were the common ancestors to both these species. And then if you go back in time, this area right here, these fossils were perhaps the ancestors of both 3, 2, and 1. So this is the common ancestor. So you can create these phylogenetic trees, if you will, to understand evolutionary history through the fossils. Pretty cool. And so fossils, just to establish what they are, they're basically preserved remnants or impressions left by the organism in the past. And so, as I mentioned before, they're sort of the historical documents of biology. And what's particularly cool about fossils, many things, is that they're ordered. There's an ordered array that appears in the sediments. Like, for example, in a dried lake bed in Nevada, United States, you could see that in certain areas there's layers upon layers of sediments of diatoms that have died in the past and have settled and have formed this strata. And you can literally go back and look at this and excavate in this quarry, if you will, and actually look at the time. We'll talk a little bit about how time is measured in terms of rock and in organic molecules in the fossil. But you can literally go back in time and say that at this particular strata, this is what was happening. It had a complete hind fin, and then back here it had a reduced hind fin. So it's pretty awesome and pretty powerful. the fossil record. And again, the sediments, this might be a basic idea, but basically the sediments formed in water, the silt, settle to the bottom, and then when an organism dies, obviously it settles to the bottom, and those deposits pile up and compress older sediments. And so you can basically go back, and these are the oldest ones right here, and these are the newest ones up here. So these are the old sediments and new ones. And eventually rock will form, and thus it's called sedimentary rock. And it's the richest source of where we can find fossils, but there's other places where you can find fossils. And so these bodies of dead organisms settle with the sediments. You know, the truth is only a tiny of the fraction of the organisms actually become preserved as a fossil, and that again might be obvious. Some of the soft tissues, some of the fat, and some of the muscle and things like that are obviously going to decompose. But things that are a little bit hard, things that are like bony, for example, are more likely to preserve. And so there are certain places that are famous, and there's actually national parks. A favorite is Dinosaur National Park here, and kids just absolutely love, and I think everyone, the kid and everyone, loves a dinosaur. And so incredible organisms that lived millions of years ago, and you can find them, the hard parts of them, in other words, the bones and teeth and shell that remain preserved for, again, millions of years. Pretty awesome. What's interesting is that sometimes under the right conditions, that sometimes minerals will dissolved in the groundwater will actually seep into the tissue of the dead organism, and it actually replaces some of the organic material, and it forms a cast and fossilized them and petrified them into, and so you can actually see bone structure that is more rock than it is bone from that organism. And then other cool examples, even more rare, are these mineralized fossils that retain organic material, and that they're found in between the layers of sandstone and shale. Like you'd have to go in there, and one of the great sites is this Burgess Shale up in Canada. You go in there with your pick, if you're a paleontologist, and you're just fracturing these like sheets of shale, and you can open them up, and it's like, wow, you can see these incredible fossilized films, if you will, of organisms that lived back in the Cambrian age. Remarkable. You can see the eye and some of the tentacle structures and some of the leg structures. Pretty impressive. And so even more rare, you can find impressions of leaves, which again are kind of soft tissue, and some of them are even slightly green, containing a little bit of chlorophyll. But probably in terms of plants, you're looking more at like preserved pollen, which is kind of a little bit more sturdy and will survive decomposition and degradation over time. Another cool thing about fossils is trace fossils. You can actually find footprints. How interesting is this? Or burrowing sites or impressions left in the sediments by the activity of animals. So, what can a footprint tell you? It can tell you a lot. Can tell you about, I'm not an expert paleontologist by any means, but it can tell you about the gait of the organism, how fast it's capable of, the weight. It can tell you a lot about a particular organism and what it was doing, and how it was hanging out, what it was capable of. It's pretty remarkable. And again, even more remarkable is that sometimes organisms can be preserved in tree sap. In other words, like crystallized in amber. And so these are really excellent examples of fossils, because these are not decaying very much at all. And even whole organisms, even down to fur, can be preserved if an organism died in a really cold environment and frozen in ice. Like a classic example of that would be a woolly mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger that died during an ice age, and it's totally preserved. Or in a real acidic area, like an acid bog, where the pH is so low that bacteria are not decomposing very well. Or a tar pit. These kinds of unusual locations where you can really get preserved bones and teeth, really almost like it died the day after. And so paleontologists talk about dating these fossils. paleontologists have a variety of ways in which they can date them. So when an organism's trapped in a sediment, you can go back and it's sort of frozen in time, and it's obviously relatively dated in context with other fossils. So fossils above it are generally younger, fossils below it are generally older, and that the younger ones are sort of superimposed on the older ones. However, you can get some interesting things happening. You can have erosion taking place, and so portions of the rock may be missing. But paleontologists, again, just like historians or crime scene investigators, are quite persistent and diligent and curious. These are the qualifications, I suspect. So the strata at one location can be correlated in time. Like, for example, this area 6 right here in this area. So different areas. And you can sort of see where the soil type is similar in an area. And this is called indexing fossils, when you look at sites that are further away like that and you're trying to figure out their distribution. And again, obviously the land is subject to erosion and different physical means, but you can sort of date an area and say that, you know, this area A right here, which is the top layer, is actually over in relationship to location 1 is actually, you know, the 4th layer down in this area. But you can sort of index fossils based on their location within the strata, and you can compare and look at geological time scale as you go back. Now, this is, when we talk about time, we're talking about a long periods of time, like millions of years. And so usually you might be familiar with a diagram like this, where we're going back millions of years, 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, 400 million years. And so this is a vast amount of time. And so paleontologists have grouped these big swaths of time into eras. If you've heard that expression before, these periods are grouped into areas, and they're known as the Precambrian area, which is before the Cambrian, the Paleozoic area, the Mesozoic era, and the Cenozoic area. And then you can go back and look at this and sort of see, well, under these conditions, this is where the first reptiles appear in the fossil record. This is where we see dinosaurs diversifying. This is the appearance of the first primate. You can sort of categorize these things in your study. Again, they could be rather elaborate. I like this. Difficult to read this, but I understand. But I like the fact that, you know, these eras are not necessarily the same time frame. The Precambrian is a vast amount of time. Okay, so hundreds of millions of years versus these are a little bit smaller. And sometimes these distinguishments between era have to do with times of mass extinction. Like, for example, right here between the Cretaceous area, 65 million years ago was a mass extinction, the 5th large mass extinction, which eliminated most of the dinosaur species on the planet Earth right around here. And so that's kind of interesting. And so how do we date fossils? We use radiometric dating, and so that's usually the method most used to determine the absolute age of a fossil, and that tracks radioactivity and isotopes. If you're familiar with this, isotopes are different species of a element, and some are radioactive, which means that their nucleus is decaying and emitting a radioactive particle. And that means that the isotope declines over time, especially after they die. And so a radioactive decay is indicated often by the transfer of one element to another element, so a parent element to a daughter element over time. And it's usually a long period of time, and so we usually consider the time it takes for half of the parent to turn into the daughter. And an example of this is carbon-14. Paleontologists love the element carbon-14 because it's a radioactive isotope of carbon. And why that one in particular? Well, you might know is that carbon is the basis of organic molecules, which are found in living organisms. And so real briefly on this is that you get, how does carbon-14 even come into being? Well, in the atmosphere, cosmic rays excite a neutron, which then cause the neutron to collide with a nitrogen-14 atom, which removes a proton, creating carbon-14. And so carbon-14 is radioactive. I'll just go like this. And so carbon-14, as you may be familiar with, carbon-14 is a component of carbon dioxide, carbon-14, but it's also there's also carbon-12 in the atmosphere as well, and there's a ratio of these two. And so plants, or other, I say terrestrial plants, but any photosynthetic autotroph is taking up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in this ratio. And then, of course, animals or heterotrophs are eating those plants, and so animals contain that same ratio in all their organic material. So all their muscle, all their bones, that any molecule that has carbon has that same exact ratio that was in the plant that was in the atmosphere. But this is kind of obvious: when the organism dies, it's no longer breathing, and so this ratio begins to change as the organism becomes a fossil. So carbon-12 is not radioactive, so it does not decay, but carbon-14, since it's radioactive, begins to decay. And you could measure the quantity of carbon-14 remaining in a fossil and correlate that to the amount that was present when the organism was alive, and note the age of the fossil. Okay, and so carbon-14 decays back to nitrogen-14 over time. Hopefully that was clear. So carbon-14 is present in all living organisms in the same proportion as in the atmosphere. I mentioned that. But when an organism dies, the 14 carbon declines, and it turns into nitrogen-14. So how long does it take for carbon-14 to decline? Well, again, half the time it takes for, like, so in other words, if you had 2 grams and it became 1 gram of carbon-14, how long did that take? It takes 5,730 years. And so we could determine the amount in the fossil relative to the one that when it was alive, and we can figure out how old the organism is as a result of that. And so it's a clock mechanism, and basically every half-life takes 5,730 years, and so every half, so a half to a quarter to an eighth to a 16, fewer and fewer carbon atoms, but again 5,730, 5,730, 5,730, until finally you have the age of the fossil. Now carbon-14s are fave for dating fossils, especially the relatively young ones, but radioactive isotopes for other elements do exist, and they have larger and longer half-lives. One of them is uranium-238. Look, you ready for this? Half-life of 4.5 billion years. Even though that's not present in living organisms, it's still found in a significant level in volcanic rock. So this means that if an organism, for example, is trapped in a layer of volcanic rock, we could date the radioactivity of uranium and deduce when that organism may have died, because if it's sandwiched in between those two layers. And so I hope this was an interesting discussion, not too dry, on the fossil record. It's again, one of the more important evidences that organisms have been changing on this planet Earth. And so I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.